Hey everyone, Danny here with the Addiction Prevention Coalition. Super excited today. We're down here in Montgomery, Alabama, the state's capital. We're here with Steve Marshall, Alabama's Attorney General. So Steve, thank you for doing this.
Thank you, Jake. Welcome.
Yeah, thank you so much. Let's jump right into it.
Great.
So we hear a lot of stuff from a lot of politicians. People talk about the opioid problem. They want to make a change, right? But people are ready for that person who's ready to say, let's put boots on the ground and make this change. You, to me, are that person, and you seem very passionate about what you do. Can you just tell me a little bit about why you're so passionate about substance abuse and why you do what you do?
Yeah, I appreciate that. Prosecutor for 20 years, which means I've seen the impact of addiction and drugs on the criminal justice system, but more importantly, on the lives of those that are in the system and the family members that are a part of that. And twofold purpose of a prosecutor really is we need to find accountability within the system to make sure that those who violate our laws, that there is accountability for their conduct. But more importantly, I think, to be very proactive is that we need to create environments so that that person doesn't come back. That once we've seen them in the criminal justice system, the next time that we see them is not in a courtroom or not in a jail, but that I see them at Walmart or that I see them at the grocery store or somehow or another I see them walking down the street and that they're telling me about life change, that they're telling me about the jobs that they have, about their family and about their children. That's what ultimately the goal is. And so as somebody that's really seen the wide range of continuum of drugs, whether it be for an area that I was from that people referred to many times as Meth Mountain. We obviously had problems with crystal meth. Seen other communities that are impacted by cocaine. But what I also have seen in the last several years when I was still the district attorney was the fact that we began to transition away from addiction to meth, more toward opioids, prescription, and then heroin and fentanyl and carfentanil. The other thing that really is what drives me in this area professionally is that unlike any of the other drugs that we've seen, here we have significant loss of life. You hear the statistics every day nationally. In fact, one of the things about Alabama is that we don't do a very good job of being able to report overdose deaths, and yet our stats still tell us that we have quadrupled the number of deaths since 2008. And so unlike anything else that we've dealt with in the criminal justice system, we now are losing lives to these particular drugs. And so when I talk about sort of what wakes me up at night and then what motivates me to come to work, it's being able to impact that particular issue. But beyond just professionally, this is a matter of faith for me. I've been very much involved with Celebrate Recovery. Many folks are aware of that. It's a Christ-centered approach to recovery that I've seen transform people in behavior. The message that we're able to give, and especially again during this time of Easter, is one of grace, because for many that are suffering from addiction that I've sat across from and just sort of talked to them about their lives, how they got to where they were, what they were suffering, kind of when they hit rock bottom, what you hear from many of them is, I don't deserve help. I'm not worthy of this concept of grace. And so, it's very interesting to be able to share, that God looks forward to what you can be, not what you were. And to be able to be a part of a step, I guess in some ways 10 steps or 12 steps, wherever you want to call it, that program, to see people work through those steps, to be able to see a transition and change in their lives, and ultimately to see that to be also something that allows them to develop a personal relationship with Jesus. That is what is very much a motivator for me, because it is a mission field for churches throughout this country, and particularly for us in Alabama, and it's one that I very much want to be engaged with personally.
Amen. That's great, because we've talked at length about my story. I'm a former heroin addict, so I know that hopelessness. I know what it's like to wake up and think God doesn't like me, or God doesn't know who I am. So it's good to hear somebody else acknowledge that we need to change this. God does care about people like me, and He does know who we are.
And that's what was so wonderful about the walk in Railroad Park, is that when you looked out into that crowd, a couple thousand people, I don't know how many we had there, but it was remarkable turnout. You see those that were from law enforcement that have dealt with people in the criminal justice system. You saw members of community who had family members who were impacted by this particular addiction. You saw those that were in active recovery that were there. And then even to meet a young man that acknowledged to me that he had used within the last week, but yet wanted to be there, wanted to be a part of something bigger than themselves. And what I thought your message was, and what I heard from so many, is that there is hope. And so, sometimes as I look at the statistics in Alabama, when you see we're #1 per capita in opioid prescriptions, when we talk about those loss of lives, it's very easy to get mired into, well, we'll never change. We can change, and I do believe there's hope, and I do believe that we have an opportunity to make a dramatic impact on this issue in the state of Alabama, and that is what I think is most inspiring. It's what is most compelling. It's what's motivating, is the fact that we're going to have the ability to intervene in lives before the bad things happen.
That's amazing. And just, watching you speak at the walk is emotional for me. As I said, with someone that's stuck in their addiction, a lot of times they think people, I guess, not like them or like you, we're in different worlds. So to see you and others come to the table and say to people who may have just used heroin last week and say, no, we're walking together. We're going to do this together. It's just really inspiring. So why do you think Alabama is one of the most adversely affected states by opioid abuse?
Yeah, it's a great question, because it really, if you look back at the data that we have, and really one of the problems in answering your question is we don't have great data. But even in the late 1990s, we were one of the top 3 states in the country that was dealing with prescription drug abuse. And so there has been, at least somewhat within the recent past for us, a history of Alabama being affected by this particular issue generally. And so I think there is a variety of things that we can look at, but it's the same sort of issues that we're dealing with nationally. And if we're particularly talking about opioids, is that we know that sort of the training that doctors received over time, it turns out that the research tells us was wrong, that we've seen this stigma in society generally that if you sort of recognize and realize that you're suffering from an addiction, that we really don't encourage you to seek help, because somehow know that means you're weak or that you're lacking character, which we know now is not at all the case. And then beyond that, one of the things that we're really trying to work on, and in recent legislation is actually going to help us, is to take a deep dive into some of the very specific Alabama data to help us understand how are we #1 per capita, because it's real easy to say, well, it's just the doctors and their prescribing. Well, it's much more complicated than that, and I think it's a much broader question than that. But somehow or another, we've got to figure out a little bit about how we got here. But what I worry about the most and what I focus on the most is not looking in that rearview mirror. That's true not only for somebody that suffered from addiction to say, we're going to look forward and not back, because looking back doesn't necessarily help us other than to understand that we don't want to make the same mistakes. But what our focus is ultimately in implementing a plan that we'll talk about, and then evaluating whether or not those steps are making a difference in society. Because the one thing that is the most impactful for me as I travel the state, and I talk about this issue a lot, is that inevitably when I speak about it and when I'm done, there'll be a line of people that want to come talk to me afterwards. And it will be, let me tell you about my personal story, and they'll share that with me. And they're always excited to share recovery, which is awesome. Then I'll have that mother or the father that'll say, I know what we dealt with, and I know it's not something that isn't impacting lots and lots of people, but it's clearly impacting my life. Or even, it was interesting, I was being interviewed by a media person one time who, once they turned the cameras off, the tears started to flow because he was sharing with me the personal story of their family. And so when we talk about Alabama's problem, we understand that we are in the boat that where everybody else is nationally. But the focus needs to be not so much how we got here, but where we are going forward.
That's a great point, great way to look at it. I know in my life, looking back has always been, I've learned to only look back when you're trying to pull someone else forward.
Right.
So that's great. So you are a co-chair on Alabama Opioid Overdose and Addiction Council. So tell us how you came to be on that council and a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's been really pleased with the work of that group. So when I became Attorney General, which was in February of 2017, there was no comprehensive plan in Alabama about how to deal with this issue, whether it be from the supply side, which is one of the ways that you sort of address it, whether it be from the prevention or the treatment side. And the other thing that sort of I saw pretty quickly is that there were people working on the issue, but there was no comprehensive, coordinated effort going forward, which I thought was necessary. And so not long after Governor Ivey took her position as governor, I went and sat down with her and I said, let me share with you what I understand to be the data in Alabama. And I talked to her particularly about the loss of life and the fact that I felt like as a state, we needed to be doing something, and I felt like that we weren't. And so, her response was, okay, then let's do something about it, number one. And by the way, let's put your money where your mouth is, and let's see your time and energy be spent on this issue. And I was very happy to be able to do that. And she formed this council, which is made up right now of a little over 40 different people, co-chaired by some really remarkable people with me, Lynn Brashear, who's our Commissioner of Mental Health, who very much has a passion in this issue, and Dr. Scott Harris, who has spent his whole life in the medical field and also being able to examine kind of from a research side public health issues in Alabama, and they've been remarkable partners in this effort. But we have around the table, we have law enforcement, we have judges, we have prosecutors, we have substance abuse professionals, we have those who are on the treatment side of the house, we have physicians and those that are impacted by the sort of the manufacture and distribution of controlled substances legally that are out there. So those folks sat around a table over about a 5-month period, a lot of work in committees that were formed around very discrete issues. And then we put together a comprehensive plan that we delivered to the governor at the very end of the year, in the end of December. And what was interesting about the delivery of that report, it felt like birthing a baby, by the way, if I could somewhat have a sense of that, because it was a lot of work and really excited about what we were able to do. But when we sat with Governor Ivey, Commissioner Brashear and I did, and we gave her the report, she kind of looked through it and said, all right, what's next? And I thought it was great, because what her challenge was, I think showed great leadership, is, look, I asked you to put together a report. Now let's make sure that what you think needs to happen in Alabama does. And so it's why, right now the most important thing that we're doing is not allowing that 27 recommendations to sit on a shelf, but to instead say, let's develop specific action plans, measurable criteria for what we're doing to be able to put this in motion. Because again, that motivator is that every day in this country we're losing 170 plus people. Every day. That's happening in Alabama. And to the extent that every day passes where we're losing lives, that is an urgency for us to be able to make a difference on this issue. And so really pleased with what we put together. In fact, I was giving a talk to municipal judges and lawyers the other day about some of the issues in that report, and from a law enforcement perspective. The speaker prior to us was also talking about opioids with him. Was from out of state, didn't know him from Adam, and he acknowledged that report as being one of the best that he's seen nationally. And so feel very encouraged about that, feel very good about kind of the specific focus areas, because the one thing that we have to recognize is, first of all, we're not going to arrest ourselves out of a problem. That's not going to occur. But this is clearly a criminal justice issue, but it's a public health issue, it's a mental health issue, and it's a community engagement issue, which is why what y'all did was so important a few weeks ago in Birmingham, is that you engaged thousands of people to have this discussion, because awareness is one of the issues that we deal with. There's not a single person that wasn't at Railroad Park that Saturday morning that didn't better understand what we were doing when they walked in. But there was also a unity behind the message, which I thought was critical.
I couldn't agree more. All right, so now that the council has released its report to the governor, is the council's work completed?
Yeah, not at all. I mean, really, this is kind of the genesis of what we have to do, because putting together a report that doesn't go anywhere means that we haven't accomplished anything, and we're not out there saving lives like we need to be. So one of the task of the co-chairs was, let's put together a broader group that now is engaged in the implementation of those very specific recommendations. I mean, some of them, we're already seeing the fruits of it, because, for example, the PDMP, which is the Prescription Drug Monitoring Database, is a robust tool that gives physicians and pharmacists the opportunity to see if somebody that's suffering addiction is doctor shopping, so that they know if Johnny shows up at the doctor on Monday and says, my knee hurts, and asking for Percocet, and then they show up at the ER on Wednesday with a back pain and say, I need some hydrocodone, and Thursday they show up at the doctor and say, I got a toothache, can you give me something for it? that database alerts our medical professionals that, hey, this person's probably got a much broader issue than what they're coming to us about. And so one of the things that we heard from our physicians, for example, was that that database wasn't user-friendly, that it didn't give them the information they needed, and wasn't something that was as helpful as it could be. And so one of the recommendations of the task force was to modernize the PDMP. And so coming out of this legislative session is a $1.1 million investment into the PDMP to make it more user-friendly and convenient for doctors and pharmacists. And so that's a very discrete action item that we're able to advance going forward. But then there's some broader issues, like one of the recommendations out of the task force came, we need to develop a specific program relating to veterans. Veterans come into addiction with very unique issues as a result of their service in the military, men and women that are coming back from having been in the Middle East and what they've been exposed to. And so one of the group's action items is, let's now develop some very specific proposals relating to veterans themselves. And again, that's not going to happen overnight. And so you see within the continuum of those 27 recommendations, some things we can do right away. And we'll have 3 of those recommendations implemented as a result of this legislative session. But then there's some broader long-term issues relating to veterans, relating to public awareness, being able to impact kids in an appropriate way involving opioids specifically, that are going to take some time. And so what our responsibility is going forward as co-chairs, and mine and particularly, because again, this is something that I believe we've got to get right, is to then hold this implementation team accountable to some deadlines and to proposals, and then to make sure that we're working toward each of those individual goals. But then beyond that, we also need to have the flexibility to understand that maybe we missed the mark. Maybe there's some things that we didn't embrace and that we didn't know that we should have seen that we didn't. And so we need to see whether or not we need to tweak recommendations, whether or not maybe something that we've done doesn't seem to be making a difference. And then be honest enough with the group to say, let's evaluate what we've done and whether or not we need to do anything differently. But I mean, I'm very much motivated and pleased by how far we've come over the last year, because we weren't to the point we had any plan going forward, but now I think that we do, and so I'm excited about that. There's a pastor by the name of Andy Stanley who wrote a book called Principle of the Path, and I very much embrace it. It's a very simple statement that your direction, not your intention, determines your destination. We can have the greatest intentions in the world about dealing with opioids and dealing with addiction, but if we're not doing something, it doesn't matter. And so very much the urgency for me to that group, and what I've sort of tried to provide leadership, is to say, we have to move, and we have to continue to make steps forward. Sometimes we may have to step back and reevaluate, but we need to continue to move forward on those specific proposals for us to be able to make a difference.
That's great, and I think that's wisdom and humility to say, maybe we did miss the mark. Let's take another look at this, because it's people's lives, as you said.
It is, and we're learning new things all the time. Part of the reason why I think we got into this situation to begin with, particularly with the rise of opiates, is that what research was being shared was flawed. When somehow or another doctors are taught there is no dosage too high of an opioid, well, that's wrong. But yet, that was somewhat the common belief, or this idea where doctors were told there's this thing called pseudo-addiction, that if somebody showed up in the office appearing to be suffering from addiction, well, that just really meant they needed more medicine. Well, again, part of the reason we got there is because maybe we didn't do a great job on the front end of figuring out how these should be used, how long they should be prescribed, and under what dosage in milligrams. And so the same thing applies to where we are on the plan going forward, is that we need to continue to evaluate the research. We need to engage some really smart people. And one of the recommendations coming out of the task force, not very sexy or exciting, was to say we need more data in the hands of people that can help us evaluate and make recommendations going forward. We now have that in place. That group will be meeting so that folks can make proposals to have access to the PDMP data that they didn't have before. But it's learning continually about how we deal with this that's going to matter. I mean, when you're working recovery, it's active. You're continuing to have to deal with that every day. We ought to be in the same boat in trying to deal with the addiction issues as a state.
That's right. So what steps have you taken as Attorney General to address the opioid crisis in Alabama?
One of which was to go to Governor Ivey to begin with and develop the council, which again I think has been very much a positive step going forward. But again, I come from the law enforcement side, and so as we talk about sort of the real buckets, if you will, that the plan sort of focuses on is opioid supply, on prevention and treatment. Well, I can be engaged in the prevention and treatment side as AG to be able to be an advocate for that, to be able to shine awareness on it. But I can impact the supply side by directly what we have an opportunity to do. And so one of the things that we've been very engaged with is trying to make sure that our legislature passes a fentanyl trafficking bill. Trafficking is our most serious drug offense. And we just hadn't caught up to the times, and you see it in the street and understand, fentanyl is what's being manufactured synthetically from China, what's coming over here, that when a therapeutic dosage of fentanyl is 2 grains of salt, and folks are bringing in grams and grams, that's showing how much of that weight could truly kill somebody. And so we need that to put in the hands of our drug task forces so that they can aggressively engage those who are trafficking in fentanyl. And then beyond that, we've got to be engaged with law enforcement to have the discussion of naloxone and Narcan and kind of what that's doing and what that means. Also to make sure that from an officer safety standpoint, they have access to it so that if they're exposed to fentanyl in a way that causes them to have health issues, that they've got access to that as well. So we're very much trying to engage the law enforcement community on this issue and be able to promote what we're doing regionally with our drug task forces to be able to attack heroin, the fentanyl and carfentanil that are out there killing folks. But then the other thing that we've done from the AG side, and it's really not a strategy, if you will, on dealing with opioids, but was to initiate the lawsuit against Purdue Pharma. We have one of the states that were involved in an investigation of manufacturers for quite some time, ultimately made the decision that Alabama needed to initiate their own case and trying to take a leadership role nationally in a discussion of what I would refer to as injunctive relief, or ways that the business of manufacturers change. Like, for example, when we filed the lawsuit on a Wednesday, within a week after that, Purdue Pharma announced they no longer were going to market directly to doctors. That's a huge change and an important change. But there are things like that we can embrace to be able to look at those that are manufacturing these drugs and how they are ultimately getting in the hands of patients and making sure that we can change practices that make sense. But also, there's losses on behalf of Alabama, and we need to be able to put money back into treatment for folks that are trying to get help, and that we need to robustly promote the drug courts and diversion courts that are where I'm seeing life change take place in the criminal justice system.
That's amazing. And so we have about a couple minutes left.
Okay.
So about 4 minutes. So I just want to kind of go off script. I want to ask you, we just had the End Heroin Walk at downtown Birmingham. We had almost 4,000 people there. You spoke with the crowd, did a great job. Share with me your heart about that event, what it meant to you, and what you think it can do for the community.
Well, what I guess I was blown away by is the emotional response of the people that were there. I've been to events, I've been to rallies. Typically people come and go. People stayed. We did that mile loop around Railroad Park. That was just kind of the beginning. That was the appetizer for the day. And what I was struck by is the mother that would come see me that had the picture of their loved one that died from an overdose. And she just wanted to tell me the story. And she wanted to share from her heart about what she faced. Spoke to the child of a friend of mine that was in active recovery. And for the first time, really had some hope about where he was going. Didn't feel like somehow or another he was a failure, but instead saw that message of hope that you shared to believe that it was there. And then the other thing that struck me was the diversity of the people that were at that event. Races, genders, economic status, what have you. People that were maybe unique to any other issue that we're dealing with in communities around the country, that were all affected by this question and this issue, but more importantly, we're unified in a belief that collectively is how we're going to be able to make a difference. And so what I thought about the event overall was just how uniquely situated we were that day to bring the people together for the common good, and that people left there feeling better than when they came, that there is a hope and that there is a path forward. And I think one of the things, the message for all of us is that recovery works and recovery matters.
Well, Steve, thank you so much. Thank you for
Oh.
everything you do. Thank you for doing this video, and we'll see you soon.
Thank you very much.
Thank
Appreciate it.